The statement remains a deeply moving expression of their core values, more relevant today than ever before. The British monarchy did not shake over a mere rumor. It shook because Prince William and Princess Anne stepped forward to confirm the tragic truth the palace tried so hard to hide. King Charles's plans to step down were no longer a backup plan. They had become an active reality. In a single, calculated moment, the heir and the ultimate defender of royal duty admitted the monarchy was preparing for life after Charles. Before looking closer at what this means for the royal family, subscribe to make sure you never miss an update. William understood the weight of the sentence before finishing it. The prince knew this was no ordinary palace update, nor a soft statement meant to ease public anxiety. The family finally stopped hiding behind sterile scripts. Anne stood beside him, completely still, carrying a heavy grief she was not permitted to show. She did not look broken, which somehow made it worse. The king's abdication plans, the formal steps for a sovereign to step down, had quietly shifted from private talks into active palace operations. Charles felt the heavy silence close in after the news broke. No one had removed or challenged the king. He allowed the truth to slip out because the burden of the crown had grown too heavy to carry in the shadows. The crown is far more than a jeweled symbol. It holds the immense constitutional duties and historical burdens of the state. For Charles, that weight became deeply personal. For William, it was an immediate reality. For Anne, it was a duty she could no longer put off. The emergency royal briefing shifted everything. Senior family members learned Charles could no longer handle the massive constitutional burden alone. A constitutional duty is the official role a monarch serves in government, even when real political power belongs to elected politicians. The room did not erupt. It froze. William listened, feeling every word pull him closer to a throne he spent a lifetime preparing for, yet never wanted to inherit this way. Anne watched Charles with intense focus, seeing him not as the king, but simply as her brother. Charles laid his pen down in silence. That tiny click carried more weight than any formal speech. The king was relinquishing much more than a daily schedule. He was surrendering the illusion that things could stay the same. William and Anne both saw it. And outside that closed family circle, Camilla was about to realize that the future had been planned without her involvement. Anne's expression hardened when an aide brought up Charles's private note. Reports from that briefing later described the message as brief, deeply personal, and sealed within a transition folder. A transition folder is a secure royal blueprint used to manage roles and handovers during a change of reign. It detailed exactly what William would inherit, what Anne would manage, and what Camilla would lose as the handover began. William did not celebrate. The future king looked overwhelmed by the massive power heading his way, while Anne remained unyielding. The princess knew grief had to wait, but the crown could not. The king's heavy silence confirmed the devastating reality. The tragedy was not the existence of a plan, but that denying it had become more dangerous than admitting the truth. As the royal court absorbed the reality, all eyes turned to the individuals whose entire lives were being rewritten. Behind the formal statements stood 4 royals trapped in an impossible situation. Charles was not just a monarch facing his own limitations, but a father watching his son approach the ultimate duty. William was not just the heir. He was a husband, a father, and a future king, forcing himself to stay calm under immense pressure. Anne stood firm like steel, but even steel can carry quiet grief. For months, Charles had desperately tried to hide these transition plans behind secure folders and carefully managed statements. Abdication means a reigning monarch formally stepping away from power. For Charles, even preparing for this scenario felt like admitting the reign he waited a lifetime for was ending before he was ready. The king demanded control, and he wanted dignity. Above all, he wanted William to inherit a stable throne, not chaos. Yet no amount of royal training could prepare William for this moment. The prince was groomed from childhood to understand duty, stoic silence, and absolute sacrifice. But preparing for the crown is nothing like watching it rush toward him with terrifying speed. A critical constitutional briefing, a formal session mapping out royal duties, was already being arranged, with an extra chair positioned right beside King Charles's usual spot. That silent seat screamed the one truth nobody dared mention. The inevitable future was no longer waiting outside. It had finally entered the room. Princess Anne felt this reality slice deeper than most. She had fiercely shielded Charles in private, standing firm during crises and demanding strength whenever weakness threatened the royal family's order. Yet the princess well knew they could not protect the crown with denial. If Charles could not voice those agonizing words, Anne would carry the burden for him. She loved her brother, but she valued the crown's survival more than his comfort. Camilla sensed the betrayal before a single word was spoken. The queen consort realized Anne and William had kept her in the dark, and her silent fury burned freezing cold. She had no need to scream to project her pain. Her absolute stillness said everything. For Camilla, this meant far more than Charles's failing health or William's rise. It was about power, influence, and the chilling realization that the final chapter of the king's reign was escaping her grasp. Official palace logs confirm that Princess Anne had personally scrutinized key sections of the secret abdication file. These highly sensitive documents outline the exact protocols if a ruling monarch decides to step down. Her backing gave the strategy a grim reality no denial could cover. William never sought this authority. Yet once Anne endorsed the plan, the household knew this was no longer a moment of panic. It was a calculated reality. Charles could feel the walls of destiny closing in. The king had delayed this painful admission to spare them, but stalling only made the weight heavier. William bore the burden of the crown's future. Anne carried the agony of demanding honesty. Meanwhile, Camilla grappled with the shock of being excluded from a massive decision that should have involved her first. Yet this crisis did not start in a boardroom. It began with one irreversible moment. A quiet, crushing event so profound that his children would never view their father the same way again. To understand what broke their silence, one must examine the precise incident that pushed the royal family over the edge. Every monarchy has a turning point etched into history. For this crisis, it was not a grand address or a state ceremony. It occurred during a quiet dinner at Windsor, as Charles reached for a red briefing folder, hesitated, and quietly asked his son to finish reading it. That tiny hesitation was the ultimate catalyst. Anne witnessed it, William absorbed it, and the household was forever changed. Charles tried to brush it off as normal, speaking softly without offering excuses or begging for pity. He simply froze mid-sentence and slid the official documents over to Prince William. These folders hold critical state secrets, packed with names, schedules, and national decisions that require absolute focus and careful execution. But inside that room, it became far heavier. It was undeniable proof that Charles was not merely exhausted, he was failing. William felt the atmosphere instantly shift. The heir had handled state documents for years, yet his father was no longer just asking for minor assistance. The king was silently pleading with him to shoulder a portion of the crown. Staring at the pages, William looked up at his father as the brutal truth hit. This was no simple delegation. While delegation usually means sharing minor tasks, this moment felt infinitely heavier, darker, and incredibly final. Anne witnessed the reality William could barely process. Observing her brother look down, the famously fierce princess held her tongue. This time, her quiet restraint was far more devastating than any sharp rebuke she could have delivered. She reached out, quietly closed the file, and let the gravity wash over them. Charles had spent a lifetime preparing for the throne, only for its weight to force cooperation prematurely. That dinner marked the point of no return, transforming quiet anxiety into cold, hard proof. William knew his destiny was no longer a distant dream. Anne recognized that safeguarding the king required action before his vulnerability became public news. For the crown, even a single fracture at the top could shatter trust in every duty, ceremony, and solemn vow. Following that night, Anne quietly demanded a full inspection of the succession plans. That night, a secret palace document captured the raw truth for the family records. These transition papers map out exactly how royal duties shift to a new heir when the throne prepares for inevitable change. Anne forced the matter with absolute precision, leaving aides unable to deny that a plan was already in motion. The abdication file was ready. Inside it, Charles had scrawled a single, crucial, handwritten instruction. William had to be shielded from delays, division, and interference. The king's quiet words carried devastating weight. He saw the danger clearly, knowing the fragile family could easily splinter during the transition. He knew Camilla would fear losing her influence, while William would view the sudden transition as a heavy burden he never wanted. William locked away the memory of that dinner, carrying it like vital evidence of everything that would soon unfold. Charles bore the memory like shame. When Camilla finally discovered this quiet Windsor moment had initiated the transition, her reaction was anything but comforting. It sparked pure anger, quickly shifting the melancholy of that dinner into an explosive confrontation. The next room Charles stepped into was stripped of peace, yet this clash remained far from public view. It unfolded behind locked doors, no cameras, no royal protocols, and no escape. William stood directly opposite his stepmother. Anne kept close to Charles as the tension in the room thickened, making the truth undeniable. The abdication plans were no longer hushed corridor gossip. They were laid bare on the table, signaling the collapse of the old order. Camilla demanded the meeting because the heavy silence had become an insult. The Queen Consort demanded to know why William and Anne were finalizing the transition details behind her back, leaving her to find out after everything was set. This transition plan served as the secret blueprint for transferring power, access, and authority between royal generations. To Camilla, these were not merely cold documents on a desk. It directly threatened her position beside Charles, her say in his final choices, and her fear of being discarded before the reign ended. William refused to lash out, knowing a single careless word could escalate their shared grief into open warfare. Speaking with absolute deliberation, he assured her that these moves were not driven by personal ambition. They had to act because Charles had reached a stage where hesitation would cause far more damage than truth. The prince's cold restraint cut deep. Camilla wanted to provoke him, but the future king offered only steady composure. Anne stood watchfully beside Charles, observing the walls close in on the weary monarch. Speaking softly but with immense weight, the princess warned that safeguarding the king was far more important than protecting anyone's personal status. Those words reframed the conflict, elevating it far beyond fragile egos and turning it into a battle for survival. A royal position, meaning one's official standing and influence, could no longer be treated as more important than the sovereign's health, dignity, and ultimate future. When Charles finally broke his silence, a heavy hush fell. In a recorded family tape, the king admitted he had personally authorized his children to draft the abdication papers, unable to carry this crushing weight alone. These pre-abdication steps represented the quiet, formal process of preparing a monarch to step down. The king spoke without any theatrical flair. He spoke like an exhausted man tired of keeping everyone else secure while slowly breaking inside. Camilla remained completely motionless. The queen consort absorbed the shocking admission, yet the true devastation lay in the next detail. A secret, locked page in the document severely restricted her authority, blocking her from controlling access to Charles's final royal decrees. This sealed document section was strictly locked away, accessible only to a select few. To Camilla, those words were not mere ink. They represented a locked, impassable door. Observing his father, the prince finally understood why the king had hesitated so long. He was not trying to target Camilla. Instead, he sought to keep the royal transition from being derailed by personal vendettas. Anne knew from experience that power vacuums invite intense pressure, which inevitably tears families apart long before it touches the crown. Charles rose, pushed back his heavy chair, and faced zero resistance. The king exited first, not in retreat, but as a sovereign, making it clear that the old status quo was dead. Camilla remained in stunned silence, while William stood resolute, carrying the weight of the future. Anne kept her composure, but her quiet demeanor hinted at the deeper truth still waiting to unfold. Yet this clash was just the beginning. Beneath the drama lay a machinery of absolute control, guided by an unexpectedly powerful player. Ultimately, Princess Anne needed no crown to command absolute authority. She demanded nothing but silence, strict discipline, and a brand of loyalty that terrified those who thrived on chaos. While Charles weakened and William prepared, Anne stood as the bridge between a dying reign and the future. She never chased power. That made her even more formidable. The moment she claimed the transition files, even Camilla knew the scales had tipped. Anne took the role because Charles trusted her when trust was hard to find. The king knew his sister would never flatter him, would never sugarcoat the truth, and would never let the family turn his decline into a private war for control. An internal transition schedule is a private palace blueprint for transferring duties, meetings, and authority from one royal to another. For Charles, that plan shielded his dignity. For William, it secured his future. For Anne, it was the thin line preventing total collapse. William relied on Anne because she treated him like a leader, not some fragile heir. He had no use for pity disguised as protocol. He needed raw honesty. Anne delivered it without apology. She coached him on when to hold back, when to speak up, and when to stop hiding fear behind patience. The crown, the ultimate weight of royal power, was rushing toward him faster than anyone thought, but she refused to let him face it unprepared. Her control was never ceremonial. She managed the timing, who saw the family, and which secrets reached William before the official transfer. That formal handover was the structured passing of crown responsibilities from one generation to the next. A single slip-up could humiliate Charles. Wrong access would pressure him, and bad intel would leave William stepping into power blind. Anne knew the stakes. She had seen how tiny cracks could bring down royal houses. Charles felt shielded, yet exposed under her watch. But the king needed someone bold enough to say what he couldn't. Yet every move she made proved he was no longer carrying the crown alone. He loved her deeply for it. Yet it also pained him. That was the brutal paradox. Her fierce loyalty saved him from ruin, while proving the old system was dead. Camilla observed Anne's rising sway with icy dread. The queen knew the princess wasn't begging for attention, making her impossible to fight. Camilla could easily duel with raw ambition. She could target emotion, but Anne's power came from relentless discipline, and attacking that only makes an opponent look desperate. Staring at the transition files in Anne's grip, the queen realized she no longer held sole access to the king's final decisions. Anne exposed a quiet war inside the palace over how fast the abdication announcement should be readied for the public. According to leaked reports from the Transition Review, this official statement would declare to the world that the monarch was permanently stepping away from the throne. Some begged for delays, hoping Charles would recover and quiet the press. Others knew waiting would look like a cover-up. Anne didn't flinch. She studied the file and asked just one question: who benefits from waiting? William received his answer in a secret clause Charles had already approved. The prince could begin his transition briefings long before any official abdication date was set, a hidden directive buried deep inside the official paperwork. That single line changed everything. It allowed William to claim the throne's shadow before anyone knew why. More importantly, it let Anne prepare him without begging permission from rivals trying to stall. And it meant Camilla's shock was only just beginning. Anne snapped the file shut, and everyone in the room knew the next phase had begun. Charles trusted her mind. William accepted her lead. Camilla watched the royal power board tilt. The levers of power were moving silently beneath the family's shared grief. The moment William entered those briefings, the palace could no longer pretend this was a simple family affair. The shift didn't trigger loud shouting. It came in quiet, microscopic changes that felt absolutely massive. A chair shifted. A briefing list changed. A private secretary addressed William first, catching his mistake too late. Charles noticed. Camilla noticed. But Anne saw everything. No dates had been announced, but deep within the palace, the tide of authority had already turned from the departing king to the waiting heir. William stepped into those highly classified briefings once reserved for Charles alone, and absolutely no one pretended it was normal. The prince sat beside the king, close enough to project loyalty, yet near enough to expose the raw truth. These transition briefings were highly confidential summits, mapping out future royal schedules and duties ahead of a monumental change. For William, this was no longer mere training, it was a dress rehearsal for a crown arriving far too fast. Charles watched his son speak with absolute, calm authority, and a flicker of deep agony nearly cracked his stoic face. The king felt a wave of relief. William was ready. Yet his heart broke, knowing that readiness signaled his own reign was fading away. Each composed word from the prince offered the institution stability, while quietly reminding Charles that the crown was slipping from his grasp. This bittersweet dynamic hung heavy in the air victory, for the son felt like defeat for the father. Princess Anne remained watchful, knowing strict discipline was the only shield keeping this royal transition from turning into an all-out war. She knew a single misstep, one heated argument, or one leaked whisper, could easily turn family grief into global scandal. This transfer of power was far more than a formal handoff. It was a fragile bridge connecting Charles's dignity, William's legacy, and the very survival of the British crown. Anne monitored the timing. She policed access and studied faces. But Camilla felt the shift most acutely once the meeting ended. The queen consort sat in silence, sliding off her gloves with a slow, deliberate gravity, processing the quiet earthquake she had just witnessed. She had once been the ultimate keeper of Charles's secrets, but now his legacy decisions were being channeled through his sister and son. No one needed to explain the writing on the wall. Camilla understood completely. Her influence had not vanished in some explosive clash. It was simply being dismantled, brick by silent brick. William noticed the calendar changes before a single word was spoken aloud. His own name now filled the ledger for major future events, where his father's had always been a quiet redrawing of the official schedule that spoke volumes about who was truly in charge. In the royal realm, official schedules are never just lists of appointments. They are declarations of power and priority. The prince saw his destiny laid out in black and white before the world had a clue. A quiet warning reached Princess Anne through a highly confidential tape from a senior palace official. The message was stark. Dragging out this transition would cause far more damage than simply executing it. Anne did not blink. She knew stalling might spare some feelings today, but it would shatter public trust tomorrow. Charles required protection, but not a defense built on fragile silence. William needed clear preparation, not a hidden path that looked like fear. Charles felt the massive institutional gears turning, and for once, he looked too exhausted to fight them. Quietly, he watched his son collect his papers. He watched his sister close her folder, knowing his wife had already retreated into a hurt silence. Softly, Charles asked his heir to remain. It was a simple request, yet it instantly shifted the gravity of the room. William froze. Anne caught the cue and slipped out without a word. Camilla was not called back. The royal apparatus faded, leaving only family behind. There were no aides with briefing books, no courtiers whispering in the hall, no polished scripts to ease the tension. Sitting alone in the quiet study, the heavy silence between them held decades of duty, unspoken disappointment, love, and profound fear. When the king finally spoke, it wasn't as a sovereign, but as a father, and William listened, knowing his youth was officially over. Charles kept the prince behind because the reality of the transition had become too heavy. Watching his heir command the room with such effortless poise had both deeply reassured the aging monarch and quietly broken his heart. These confidential strategic briefings were designed to map out the inevitable path before the final handoff occurred. To Charles, the meeting proved his son could carry this weight. For William, it was clear evidence that his father was on the brink of letting go. Sitting across from him, he chose not to rush the moment. He knew this transcended official paperwork and palace politics now. The quiet plan for abdication had become deeply, painfully personal. To step away from the throne was an ancient legal concept, but to this family, the word no longer felt like constitutional law. It felt like a profound, impending loss. Charles wasn't managing a procedure, he was revealing the terror of his own vulnerability. The king ultimately confessed his deepest vulnerabilities in a private recording, preserved for the royal archives. He told his son he was terrified of leaving him a damaged institution, one plagued by deep division, eroding public trust, and private warfare constantly leaking into the headlines. Charles didn't fear William's capability. He feared the wreckage waiting all around them. The prince felt the raw pain in those words. For a moment, the future king had no answer grand enough to cover it. William answered as a son, not an heir. He confessed that watching his father disappear behind duty terrified him far more than the crown itself. That raw confession shifted the room. It stripped away ceremony and rank. Normally, an heir is simply the person next in line to inherit the throne. But in that quiet moment, William wasn't thinking about inheritance. He only thought of losing pieces of his father to a crown that never stopped demanding more. Charles looked down as William reached for his hand. The touch was brief, almost fragile, but it held more truth than any official palace statement. The king had spent his life hiding behind controlled emotion. Yet that tiny gesture broke the cold distance duty built between them. William wasn't holding on for power. He held on because his father looked exhausted, and silence often speaks when loyalty cannot. Charles then revealed why Princess Anne was brought so close to the plan. The king explained that he had asked Anne to shield them from internal resistance, knowing some in the royal family would try to delay the transition. At its core, a transition means moving royal duty and authority from one leader to another. Charles trusted Anne because she would never bend under immense pressure. And William trusted her because she would deliver the raw truth before others could soften it. William understood the warning instantly. He knew a delay could look respectful to the public while causing deep harm behind closed doors. He promised Charles he wouldn't rush the throne out of ambition, but he wouldn't delay taking it out of fear either. That promise gave the king something formal palace language never could: true peace of mind. It proved William would carry the crown with restraint, not hunger. Charles accepted that vow with a silence that felt heavy and final. This emotional handover didn't begin with a grand proclamation or ceremony, but with a father trusting his son to survive a burden he could no longer carry alone. William left that room changed. Charles remained behind, feeling both lighter and sadder at once. But while father and son found peace in private, the outside world erupted in public chaos. By the next morning, the palace could no longer contain the massive secret William and Anne had confirmed. The news broke across Britain like a heavy bell tolling for a funeral and a coronation at the exact same time. People didn't just hear about Charles's abdication plans, they truly felt the end of a long, familiar era. In that first wave of public reaction, quiet grief and heavy expectation stood side by side. William appeared completely calm, because projecting calm was now his absolute duty. The prince stepped into the spotlight, wearing the guarded expression of a man who knew a single tremor or slip of emotion could plunge the nation into deeper shock. This public reaction refers to how everyday citizens, media outlets, and leaders respond when a historic royal secret is finally exposed. This mattered because the royal family survives not only through law, but through collective belief. If the public believed the transition was controlled, the crown could breathe. If they saw chaos, the damage would spread like wildfire. Charles remained hidden behind palace walls, while the nation whispered his name with a softer, gentler kind of sadness. The king wasn't gone yet, but many were already mourning him as if his historic chapter had already closed. News anchors pointed to the confirmation from William and Anne as the ultimate sign that his reign was entering its final stage. That term carried massive weight because a reign is the actual span of time a monarch serves on the throne. For King Charles, it wasn't just a measure of time, it was a lifetime dream now rapidly narrowing under pressure. Princess Anne became the unexpected anchor of the entire national conversation. One commentator called her the guardian of the handover, a powerful phrase that instantly shifted the narrative. This term, handover, means the carefully structured passing of official duties from one royal to another. Hearing it tied to Princess Anne made the public realize she wasn't just standing in the wings, she was fiercely protecting the process and protecting Charles. Anne was shielding William from the toxic family battles that could easily turn a painful transition into a deep public wound. Anxious crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, some clutching flowers, others standing in absolute silence, as if waiting for history to unfold. As the sovereign's official London residence, the scene outside Buckingham Palace gates quickly became a profound symbol of the nation's mood. That morning, public sentiment was far from simple. Many looked heartbroken for King Charles, while others turned to William with quiet expectation. The crowd roared with a mix of goodbye and new beginnings. Camilla watched their reaction, her heavy silence feeling like total defeat. The Queen Consort knew the public did not care whether this decision had wounded her deeply. The nation only cared if Charles would be protected and if William was ready. That sudden shift stung far worse than any harsh criticism. She had feared losing power inside palace walls, but outside, a colder reality was taking shape, a public narrative moving forward without her at the center. William tensed up the moment his father's name was mentioned during a brief talk with palace staff. The prince kept his expression perfectly still, but his inner circle saw the pain behind that mask. He was praised for being ready, while still grieving the heartbreaking reason why. That was the cruelest part. The stronger William appeared, the more real his father's fading reign became. One front page captured the mood with brutal simplicity. A stark, monochrome portrait of Charles sat beneath a bold headline, "The Long Goodbye." Those words spread fast because they dared to say what official statements could not. The king remained. The crown still stood, but an emotional era had already begun to end. Aides tried to manage the narrative, but the truth from William and Anne carried far more weight than any PR statement. The public knew. The shift was real. The nation felt it. And as the outside noise faded, the gravity of the moment became painfully clear within the palace walls. Ultimately, the tragedy was not that King Charles was preparing to step down. It was that admitting it forced everyone to acknowledge what love, loyalty, and duty had desperately tried to hide. A reign was winding down before the family was emotionally ready. A sun was rising before the nation had finished saying goodbye. And Princess Anne, unshakable until the end, stood as the ultimate witness to heartbreak and duty. William knew this sudden confirmation had crossed a line that no official statement could ever undo. The prince and Anne had dragged Charles's transition plans out of the shadows and into reality. To abdicate means a monarch choosing to step down. For this family, it was no longer a distant rumor. It felt like the truth was finally out. The monarchy mattered now because silence was no longer enough to save it. It demanded perfect timing, flawless order, and courage from the very family members who were hurting the most. Charles felt the crushing weight of acceptance slowly settle over his shoulders. His deepest defeat was not losing power, as authority had already begun shifting toward William. The true ache came from knowing his family had to help him step down with dignity. A reign is a lifetime on the throne. Yet for Charles, it represented a whole lifetime of waiting, sacrifice, and quiet hope. Now, protecting that legacy meant planning its end. The king knew there was no gentler way left to face it. William did not view this moment as a triumph. The prince's power lay in his restraint, not raw ambition. He bore the heavy crown without rushing to seize it. That was crucial, as the nation needed to see duty, not greed. One wrong step could make it look like his father was forced out, but hesitating too long would make the institution look weak. So the future king stood in that painful gap, balancing his father's dignity with the very survival of the crown. Anne took charge because she refused to let grief turn into royal chaos. She kept the family together, managed the process, and ensured her brother was not humiliated during this delicate transition. A transition is the careful handoff of power and duties from one generation of royalty to the next. A leaked palace report later described her actions as a protective command words that captured her spirit perfectly. She did not grab power. Instead, she stood firm when everyone else was too broken. Camilla's fading influence only highlighted a deeper truth. The queen consort had not been cast aside, but she would no longer dictate the final chapter of Charles's reign. Camilla realized that Anne and William were now the true protectors of the monarchy's future. The reality stung, showing exactly where the king had placed his ultimate trust. The crown, the ultimate symbol of royal duty, was now being guarded by those sworn to protect it, not those desperate to stay close. Charles was not pushed aside, and William was not driven by greed. Anne did not seize authority, and Camilla was not ruined, though she had to accept a much smaller role in this final chapter. Every family member played a painful part in this historic handover, exposing the raw truth behind the quiet palace walls. The crown chose survival through its own deep sorrow. It stopped pretending nothing had changed, and by doing so, found the only honest path forward. While this news closed a chapter in grief, it gave the throne what it needed: honesty, order, and a future strong enough to carry the heavy weight of its past. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.